Welcome. Welcome to this Conservation Applied Research and Development, or CARD webinar. Thanks so much for joining us today. We hope that you and your families are continuing safe and healthy during the evolving COVID-19 situation. And we also want to thank you in advance for your patience with any technical difficulties we might have related to the fact that all of us are connected remotely. I'm Mary Sue Lobenstein, the R&D Program Administrator at the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Division of Energy Resources. And with me today is Lindsay Anderson, State Program Administrator at the Department of Commerce. Lindsay provides project development support, program evaluation, and public information coordination for programs related to statewide industrial, commercial, and residential building energy efficiency, as well as for energy assurance. Lindsay is a project manager of this CARD project and will be handling the Q&A portion of the webinar. Our presenter today is Scott Pigg from Slipstream, where he leads residential building performance research activities. Scott designs and implements studies assessing energy efficiency and renewable energy market opportunities and strategies. He also conducts numerous monitoring studies designed to reveal how well energy efficient equipment functions in the field. This webinar today will be recorded and will be available on both the department's and Slipstream's websites at a later date. The slide set from the webinar will also be available. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items for those viewing online so that you know how to participate in today's webinar. Each of you should see a control panel somewhere on your screen. The location depends on whether or not you're using your phone or your computer. If you are using your computer, you can expand and collapse the panel by clicking on the orange arrow. Also, be sure to maximize your screen for better viewing experience. To listen by default, you have joined the presentation using your computer's speaker system. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane of the control panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. Also, all attendees have joined the webinar with their audio muted. If you are having sound or audio issues, head up to the audio tab, click on the sound check, and that usually resolves any issues you're having. If that doesn't work, try switching between phone and computer call-in. If you are still having problems, try closing out of GoToWebinar and re-enter. You can submit questions to our presenter at any time during the presentation using the questions pane. Simply type your question and submit it. If there are questions we are unable to answer, the presenter will follow up with you after the webinar. By means of background, this webinar is one in an ongoing series designed to summarize results from research projects funded by Minnesota's Applied Research and Development Fund, which was established in the Next Generation Energy Act of 2007. The purpose of the fund is to help Minnesota utilities achieve their energy savings goal. $2.6 million of the fund is set aside annually for CARD program, which awards research grants in a competitive request for proposal process. Results from CARD projects provide utilities with data to enhance energy efficiency program designs within their CIP portfolios. As you can see by this pie chart, CARD projects funded to date have been in all building sectors, as well as some that cross all or multiple sectors. The subject of today's webinar is in the residential sector and discusses the results from visits to 100 newly built or renovated Minnesota homes in order to model their characteristics and discover baseline energy use, as well as the potential for beyond-code energy savings. Now I'll turn it over to Scott for today's presentation.
Thanks, Mary Sue, and good morning, everybody. So I'm going to be spending the better part of the next hour going over this CARD study that we recently conducted of construction practices and energy savings opportunities for new and renovated homes in Minnesota. And just by way of clarification, there were actually two concurrent studies that we did, one for residential buildings and one for buildings that were subject to commercial energy code. I'm only covering the residential study today. If you're interested, just stay tuned, and there'll be a similar webinar to this one on September 22nd, where some of my colleagues will be talking about the commercial study. And just to be clear, these are the kinds of buildings that are covered by residential energy code in the state and that are within the scope of the study that I'm talking about today. Obviously, single-family homes, detached homes, and townhomes are both residential, but also duplexes and apartment buildings or condos, any kind of multifamily, so long as it's 3 stories in height or less. Any multifamily buildings that are more than 3 stories high are subject to commercial code, and those buildings are included in the scope of the commercial study that we'll be going over on the 22nd, and you won't hear me talking about those today. So just by way of background, this study had 4 key goals. First and foremost, we just wanted to characterize current construction practices for new and renovated homes in the state. Secondly, we wanted to look at how much lost savings there is from homes currently being built or renovated below prescriptive code levels, and losses in quote marks there for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But similarly to that, but going beyond it, we were also interested in what are the savings potential for going beyond current prescriptive code in terms of how much technical potential there is for, like further improving the efficiency of new homes. And then all of those are in the service of providing guidance to the Minnesota utilities for their new construction and renovation programs, as is the overarching objective of the CARD program itself, is to help the Minnesota utilities with their conservation improvement programs. So one thing I want to make clear is that this is not a formal code compliance study, and there's a few reasons that I say that. First and probably foremost is that, as many of you on the call right now probably already know, there are multiple ways that a builder can comply with Minnesota energy codes. Prescriptive code, U-factor alternatives, total UA, performance path. I'm not going to go into much detail about those, but just suffice to say that there are different ways that a builder can comply. The way we went about our study is we came in after homes were built to do our on-site data collection. We had minimal contact, almost no contact with any builder, so we don't offhand know which path a builder used. And you can't really assess a home for actual compliance unless you know the path that was used. So what we're doing instead here is we're using prescriptive code as a benchmark for when. So when I talk about lost energy savings, what I'm really referring to is the energy savings for ceiling insulation that was below prescriptive code levels. Regardless, the home may well have complied with code, even though it had a ceiling insulation level that was a bit below the prescriptive code level. That's really the baseline that we're using here. And we use prescriptive code because we think it's the most common way that builders comply with Minnesota code, and it's the easiest one to understand by far. And for the most part, I think that that baseline or point of reference gets us in the neighborhood of what a Minnesota home's base energy use looks like relative to prescriptive code. So then another thing that I want to point out is, as I mentioned, we studied homes that had already been occupied for some time. The average was about 2 years. And so in some cases, people could have changed some things about their homes that are subject to code, like for instance, lighting. Somebody could have come in and changed out some of their fixtures. So we did try to ask about those changes and take them into account in our analysis, but we don't know for sure that we caught all of them. So that's another reason why we can't really hold this up as some sort of formal code compliance study. And then finally, the objective of this study was not really about assessing code compliance. It's really more about what level of efficiency is being built into new Minnesota homes and renovated homes, and how does that compare to code. But the main interest is about efficiency levels. And there are a number of things that we care about from an efficiency perspective that aren't even really subject to code, chief among those being equipment efficiency, which in residential buildings is determined by federal minimum efficiency standards and is not something that's specified in state code. So for all of those reasons, we just wanted to be clear that this is it's a characterization study and an energy efficiency kind of potential study that references prescriptive code, but it's not really a code compliance study per se. Okay, so just a few words about how we went about doing this study. So there are actually three aspects to it: single family new construction, single family renovation, and then low-rise multifamily new construction. Single family new construction seems to dominate the energy footprint among all three of those. And given the amount of time we have today, I'm just going to talk about single family new construction. I'm not going to say anything at all about single family renovation or the low-rise multifamily that we actually use data from a separate DOE study for. But all of those, both of those other two topics are included in the final report. So you're welcome to get your hands on that and read about those two. So in terms of the single family new construction, the bulk of this study involves on-site visits that we did to 87 new homes around the state. And I won't go into the details, but we had a formal sampling plan that meant first sampling counties in the state, then going to those county authorities, getting property tax rolls and identifying the new homes on the property tax rolls, and then finally, calling up homeowners or sending postcards and recruiting homeowners for the study. So in the end, we contacted 30 out of the 87 counties in the state. We ended up getting participants in 20 counties. And part of our recruitment strategy is that we wanted to make sure that we had a good split between the northern half of the state and the southern half, because part of that is that there are different climate zones for code compliance purposes. And then we also wanted to make sure that we had a decent sample of homes in parts of the state where there's no code enforcement mechanism. As many of you know, in order for a jurisdiction in Minnesota to enforce code, it has to be formally adopted by that jurisdiction, and not all jurisdictions have done that. We estimate that about 20% of the new homes that are built in the state are built in areas where there is no formal code enforcement. And we actually, there was some interest in this going into the study, so we actually tried to recruit more homes into the study than you would normally find in the population, and we were partly successful in that. So our final sample of 87 is kind of overweighted for homes in the north and overweighted for homes that are in jurisdictions that don't have code enforcement. But to bring it all back to a proper statewide level and statistics that are representative, we had some weighting procedures that we go through to account for the fact that we're oversampled in those ways. So we would recruit a home into the study, and then one of our two crack technicians would go out there and spend a few hours on site collecting all kinds of data, obviously basic home characteristics and stuff, insulation levels, where we could observe them, because we're going into occupied homes, walls are closed up, so we can't directly look at the level or the quality of the insulation in the walls. But we did use infrared scans as much as possible to, at least make sure that there weren't big areas of missing wall insulation, for example. We recorded the characteristics about the windows. We did blower door tests for air leakage in just about every home. We did duct leakage testing in some homes. All the homes that we were able to do it in that had duct runs outside of the thermal envelope, that's important for code purposes. And in addition, we also tested duct leakage in some homes that didn't have any exterior duct runs, just so we could get a good handle on that. And then obviously we went around and recorded all the characteristics of the heating, cooling, water heating systems and various appliances. Something that sucked up a fair amount of time in the data collection protocol was going around to every lighting fixture and recording what kind of lighting light bulbs they had in there. And then after the fact, we contacted the utilities that served the homes that we visited and got information about which homes were either in a utility whole home certification program or may have gotten an incentive for, say, a heating system or an air conditioner or something. So we take all of that data that we collected on site, key it in to some databases, and then a key part of this analysis is that we set up an energy model for each home that we visited using the REM rate software that's commonly used for new construction. And we developed an energy model for each of those 87 homes that we could then tweak. We could run the model with the home exactly as built, and then we could run variants. For example, if we took all of the things that we found that were below prescriptive code for that home and brought them just up to prescriptive code, we could run another model and see how much energy use and energy costs would save. Or we could take all the homes and take them to a very efficient level and model their energy use and compare that to the as-built condition. And I'll be going through some of that in those results in a few minutes, and those form a big part of what we found in the study. But first, let's just step back a bit and talk big picture about the single-family new construction market. So from census data, we know that since we've come out of the 2008 Great Recession and things have recovered and we haven't gone into any kind of COVID recession yet, in terms of building, the most recent data is telling us that there's somewhere between 12 and 14,000 new single-family homes built in the state each year. And so these two maps show the percent of those homes that have natural gas service by county, with the map on the left being just like a regular county map of the state, and the one on the right being what the state would look like if you resize each county to be proportional to the number of new homes that are built in that county in a year. And you can see from that one on the right, it's pretty obvious that the Twin Cities dominates the new construction landscape in the state, and just about all the homes in that area, as well as around some of the second tier cities like Rochester or Fargo, North Dakota, have a very high prevalence of having natural gas service. And overall, our estimate is that statewide, about 80% of the new homes that are built do have natural gas. The biggest exception being up in the northern part of the state, as you can see from the map, where there's just like less gas service territory up there. And similarly, there's almost an 80-20 split between the new construction market in the south versus that in the north, as well as an 80-20 split between homes built in code enforcement areas versus those that are not in enforcement areas. But it's not always the same 80-20, so it's not like the same 20% of homes are all in the north and all don't have natural gas service. There's like a little bit of a mixing going on across the state. But generally speaking, you can kind of picture this as two markets. One is the roughly 80% of homes that are in urban or suburban areas that are mostly served by the bigger, mostly investor-owned utilities, and that mostly have natural gas service. Then there's this other smaller, say 20% market that is made up of homes that are built in more rural areas where they're unlikely to have natural gas service, and so the space heating strategies is a much more complex stew of propane and electricity, and where the homes are less likely to be in a jurisdiction that has code enforcement, and where a good chunk of them are served by the smaller electric cooperatives. And so we'll talk a little bit later about what that means in the context of utility programs. Okay, so now let's dive in a little bit into some of the results from the modeling. And what I'm going to start with, energy cost is the easy common denominator, so to speak, for how to roll up the fact that, you know, all the homes are using electricity. Some of them are also using natural gas, some propane, and a few are even using wood. So I'm mostly going to be talking in terms of energy costs. But if we start with a set of models for our 87 homes where each home, this is not the as-built model. This is if we set everything in each home exactly to prescriptive code. So if, you know, prescriptive code calls for R49 ceiling insulation. So for that set of runs, we set all the ceiling insulation to R49 for all 87 homes. And then if we run all those models and we get a nice weighted average of annual energy cost, we come up with $2,245 for the prescriptive code exactly compliant average home in this state, with a sampling error margin of plus or minus $150 or so. So we take that as a starting point, and now if we compare that number to the model runs where we just model the home exactly as built. So if that ceiling has R44 instead of R49, we model it that way, or if it has R60 instead of R49, we model it with that higher level of ceiling insulation. We just model everything as we found it in the home. And what we see there is that the average actually comes down by $85 per home, which says that on average, Minnesota new homes are being built to be a bit better than code, about 4% better than if every home was built exactly to prescriptive code. And I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but the main driver behind new homes being built a bit better than code is that they're actually built tighter than required in terms of air leakage. And to a lesser extent, they tend to have windows that are a bit better than code requirements. Okay, so that as-built model includes some things that are right at prescriptive code levels, some things that are above code levels, but also some things we found that were below prescriptive code. So if we go to a third scenario where we take everything that we found that was below prescriptive code, and now we bring it just up to prescriptive code, that's what that gives us our third scenario that further reduces average energy cost by just a little bit, $30, or maybe, you know, worth like a little bit more than 1%. And that difference, that $30 difference, is what I'm referring to when I say lost savings. So these are the savings that would be there if we took every home as we found it and just corrected all the stuff that we found that was below prescriptive code right up to prescriptive code. And you can see it's not a very big number. We found quite a few places where things weren't up to prescriptive code, but for the most part, the energy implications are not that big. I mean, if you've got an attic that's at R44 versus R49, when we model that difference, it just does not add up to very much in the way of energy cost savings. Okay, so we got one more scenario to look at, and that's where we take everything up to a super efficient level. And by super efficient, the way we kind of set that scenario is we said, let's take the most efficient homes that we found for whatever, and we'll set that as our beyond code scenario. So for example, we had, I think, 3 homes in the study that had like really high performance triple pane windows. So for windows in this Beyond Code scenario, we set all the windows for all the homes up at those, like really high performance triple pane levels. And we did the same thing for ceiling insulation, wall insulation, equipment efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we do that and we remodel all of our 87 homes, now we get a big drop of like 25% compared to, the scenario above that just has everything either at or above code as observed. And, I'll be the first to say that's a pretty pie in the sky scenario. The notion that you could get every aspect of every new home built in the state to suddenly be as efficient as the most efficient homes that we had in our sample. But it at the 50,000 foot level, it does suggest that there's still plenty of room, technical potential to continue to improve the energy efficiency of new homes with materials and techniques that are already being done in at least some of the homes in the state. And in a little bit, I'll dive into a little bit more detail about what are the biggest measures that contribute to both the lost energy savings and the Beyond Code potential. But first, let's take that as-built scenario and break it down into some subgroups. So here, we've got in the green stripe on this slide shows the statewide average of as-built of $2,160, and then the blue stripes show different subgroup breakouts of within the state from our sample. And so the one that really sticks out, and actually the only one that's really statistically significantly different, is homes that have natural gas versus those that don't have natural gas. And that's mainly just because propane and electricity are more expensive fuels than natural gas is. And so if you have to heat with propane and or electricity, it's just gonna end up costing you a fair bit more to heat your house or heat your hot water. That's also a lot of what drives the distinction that we have here between northern homes and southern homes. Remember, northern homes are the least likely to have natural gas service, so they're the most likely to be heating with propane and natural gas. Also not helped by the fact that it's a bit colder up in the north than it is in the southern part of the state. Sorry, I advanced just a little too soon there. There's a last distinction that I want to call out here on the bottom 2 bars, which is that at first glance, it looks like utility program homes, are about 10%, have about 10% lower operating costs than non-program homes, which sounds great. It might lead you to say, well, that's because, if you're a utility program participant, you're putting in more insulation and your house is tighter and so on and so forth. But actually, a lot of what's driving that difference that we see on this slide in operating costs is the fact that most utility program participants are in the southern part of the state, and the vast majority have natural gas service. So it's more to do with kind of the climate and the heating fuel than it is to do with the inherent efficiency difference between program homes and non-program homes. And you can see that in this slide, where instead of looking at energy costs, we're looking at what we're calling a heating load intensity, which is just the amount of heat that goes through the building shell per square foot per heating degree day. So we're taking, in this one, we're taking out entirely what kind of fuel you use to heat with, what efficiency level the equipment is. We're even taking out the size of the home, and we're trying to normalize for differences in degree days between the southern part of the state and the northern part of the state. So it's just really trying to equalize it in terms of like the shell performance of the home. And what you can see here is that, you know, when you do that, now all of a sudden there's hardly any difference between program homes and non-program homes that were in our sample. And that is a pretty important finding, that even if you drill down further into like, well, how do the program homes and non-program homes compare in terms of ceiling insulation, air leakage, et cetera, we don't really see much different. But we have to be careful about how we interpret that finding. It doesn't necessarily mean that the utility programs have not had an impact on new home construction in the state. Because one of the things that we found, one of the interesting things was that we had quite a few program homes in our sample. I think 27 out of our 87 homes were program participants. And if you use that as the basis for an estimate for utility program penetration into the new construction market, it works out to be about 40% of new homes are utility program participants. And at that level of market penetration, it could be that utility programs are having an impact on practices that go beyond just the immediate homes that they certify, and they could be having wider market effects. Now, it was not at all within the scope of our study to even speculate as to the extent or whether that's the case or to what extent. And so I can't really say anything at all about that here. Our main recommendation coming out of this finding is just that the utilities, policymakers, program regulators should be having a dialogue about, you know, this finding of no difference between program and non-program homes, what that means in terms of kind of the logic model for these programs and the baselines that are used for calculating savings. And I'll say a few more words about that at the end of my talk. And before I leave the slide, just in case you've been looking at that graph and wondering why the heck is it that the subgroup with the lowest heating load intensity and therefore the highest shell performance per square foot is in code non-enforcement jurisdiction, I have to confess I don't have a really good answer for that. It may have something to do with the fact that these non-enforcement homes tend to be in rural areas. They're much more likely to have slab on grade construction, and it may be something to do with all of that just maybe tilts the table towards a little bit lower heating load intensity for those homes than others. Okay, so now I want to go back to the lost energy savings that we estimated for items being below prescriptive code. And let's break that apart a little more finely. And you can see from that top green bar that overall, you know, we came up with about around a 1% lost energy savings in terms of energy costs relative to prescriptive code. Now, and when we break that 1% into like what contributes, what goes into that 1%, it breaks out into 5 or 6 things, 5 of which are things that if those items were brought up to prescriptive code, it would result in reduced energy costs. And then there's one that if you actually corrected these things that are not to prescriptive code, would increase energy consumption that offsets a good chunk of the other ones. And you can see from the slide that one is mechanical ventilation that I'll talk about last with its own slide. But if we just kind of quickly walk through the ones at the top of this graph, yeah, we did find some percent of homes that had ceiling insulation that was, for example, R44 instead of R49, some under insulated areas and other areas as well. If you corrected all of that, it's worth maybe a little bit less than 1% in reduced energy costs. And then with air leakage, even though I said that on average homes are built are better than code, we did have some that did not meet code requirements in terms of air leakage. If you corrected those, it's worth a little bit of reduction in energy costs on average. Similarly, for duct leakage, code had a requirement that if you have ducts outside the thermal envelope, they have to be insulated and they have to pass a leakage test. Only about 1 in 4 homes in our sample had any ducts that were outside the thermal envelope, but our testing suggested that when you do have those exterior duct runs, more often than not, they don't meet the testing requirement for leakage, and so you'd get a little bit of savings by further tightening those ducts to meet that code requirement. And then for lighting, code requires 75% of all the hardwired fixtures to be high efficacy lighting, meaning LED or CFL or something. And we did find some lighting that, or some homes that didn't meet that percentage threshold. And so there would be maybe 1% worth of energy savings, energy cost savings from correcting that. And then water heater recirculation, that one's an interesting one. And what that is some people put, like a little pump in a loops to reduce the amount of time it takes to get hot water to your far off bathroom that's way far away from the water heater. And code says that if you have a recirc system like that, you have to insulate your the pipes for obvious reasons. Now, we only had 5 homes out of 87 that had a recirc system, but 4 of those didn't have insulated pipes. And our modeling says to us that there's a pretty hefty energy penalty to be recirculating hot water all or much of the day in pipes that aren't insulated. And so this 0.4% that you see here is, kind of a mix of a small percent, only a small percentage of homes, but a pretty big penalty when it occurs. Okay, so now let's dive into that mechanical ventilation one that goes in the opposite direction of the other ones. Minnesota is unique in the country in requiring balanced mechanical ventilation for new homes. And it doesn't require heat recovery, but in most cases, in fact, in every case that every home that we went into, that means a heat recovery or an energy recovery ventilator, like the one in the photo here, being installed in the home. And as part of our data collection process, we documented a whole bunch of ways that these systems were messed up. And you can see from that graph on the left that we found widespread issues with mechanical ventilation system, a number of which have to do with how people either use or don't use the system once they move in, or maintain or don't maintain it. And all of that is like a whole other topic that I'm not going to talk about in much detail, and that for our calculation purposes, we didn't really even address any of that. All of our modeling assumed that the system was, as long as we observed it to be capable of operating properly, we assumed that it was operated properly and maintained properly. But we did find some homes that didn't have the required system. We found a few systems that didn't work. And so, correcting those code items so that to put in a system where one wasn't there obviously has something of an energy penalty associated with it. But generally speaking, the biggest issue that leads to that, that graph pointing to the left on the previous slide, is this third one from the top about air handler interlock. And what that's all about is that one of the things we found is that the way most builders put in these ventilation systems is that they install the HRV or ERV, but they don't install all separate ductwork for it. What they do is they have a short runs for in and out of the unit itself, but then they couple those into the home's main heating and cooling ductwork, and use that ductwork to do double duty to get the fresh air into the house itself. And what code says is that when you do one of these, some of us call them punch-in system, you have to interlock the ventilator with the main furnace or the air handler, so that whenever that ventilator is running, you're also running the circulation system for the main heating and cooling system. And if you don't do that, then the fresh air that you just put through your ventilator and dumped into your main heating and cooling ductwork doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't get into the home. So you end up with really awesome indoor air quality for about 10 or 12 feet of duct run in the basement, and nothing getting delivered to the living spaces where we care about it. So that's it's obviously pretty important to have that interlock operating in place and operating if you have that kind of punch-in system. But we found a lot of homes where there wasn't an interlock. So adding that interlock obviously improves it. Well, you could expect it to improve the air quality of the actual living space, because you're now getting fresh air to those spaces. But it also adds quite a bit of electricity, because you can imagine these systems are often running 24/7 or 20 minutes out of the hour, and it just adds up to thousands of hours of this ventilation system running, where now you also have a furnace air handler that has to be running as well. So when we model adding that interlock, it ends up adding a fair number of kilowatt hours to the energy costs of the house. And that's the main thing that drives the fact that bringing those HRVs and ERVs up to code what has a negative energy implication in our modeling. So before I leave this one, there are several things that utility programs can do here. One is to encourage builders to put in systems that don't require that interlock, so they have at least the fresh air ductwork is separate from the main heating and cooling ductwork, so that you don't have to operate that furnace air handler whenever you're operating the ventilator. Another one is that there is a range of efficiencies in these HRVs and ERVs, and we found the full range in the homes that we went into, including in utility program homes. So utilities could, encourage builders to put in the systems that are on the higher efficiency end of the heat recovery spectrum. And then, of course, all the issues that you see here about people not being aware, not operating their system, all of that is something that could be incorporated into utility programs to make sure that people are using these systems and maintaining them as designed. And that also, like state code training or there could be state outreach effort for all of that. And that kind of, homeowner training and education is probably especially important now that in the middle of this COVID pandemic, where everybody's thinking about, having good indoor air quality and air exchange rates. Now, all of this mechanical ventilation stuff takes on extra importance because of what we found for air leakage. And we just found a lot of very tight homes in our sample. And you can see the graph on the left, each dot on that graph is one of the homes that we tested, and they're sorted so that the tightest home is on the left and the leakiest home is on the right, and all expressed in terms of like air changes per hour at a blower door test pressure of 50 pascals. But basically, the tighter the home, the lower it is on this graph. And you can see the code requires a home to be tested at or below 3 air changes per hour, 50 pascals. And you can see that the vast majority of the homes that we visited are below that level, and some are considerably below that level. And it's just a small minority of homes that are even moderately more than 3 ACH 50. And that result is kind of interesting if you put it in the context of similar field studies and tests that have been done in other states, which is what I have in the graph on the right, where what we found in Minnesota is the green bar on the top, and then there's a bunch of dark blue bars that represent similar field studies done in various states over the last few years, kind of grouped by what code requires for those states, and the light blue bars in the background there shows you what the code requirement is for each one of those states. And so what you can see is that, you know, Minnesota down there at 2 ACH 50 on average. It's really only Wisconsin that's even in the vicinity of Minnesota in terms of tightness, with maybe Nebraska being in the number 3 position. And it's really kind of a head scratcher for me about how, you know, what is driving this, because you might think, well, if you have if your code requires, if you have a tight requirement for code for air leakage, that would do it. But then that doesn't totally add up, because if you look at Massachusetts and Maryland, which are states that have the same code requirement as Minnesota, they're up above 3 on average. And then you might think, well, maybe it's you know, states where they've got robust programs, you know, utility or other new construction programs that have been going on for a while. Well, it doesn't add up for Wisconsin, because Wisconsin, oh, I'm sorry, I should back up and say the code thing also doesn't add up, because Wisconsin is the most similar one to Minnesota, and it doesn't even have a testing requirement, right? Now, Wisconsin has programs similar to Minnesota that have been going on for quite a while and have a pretty good market penetration. So you might think it's programs that are driving toward tighter construction, but Massachusetts and Maryland have you know, pretty extensive new construction programs, and yet they're not down at 2 ACH 50. And then you have Nebraska, that's, you know, like the 3rd lowest among all these states, that not only has a very loose code requirement, but also doesn't really have much in the way of new construction programs. So there's some sort of dynamic going on here that has more to do with just what the code requirement is, or how extensive the new construction programs have been in the past. All right, just a few words about what we found about mechanical systems and lighting. For heating systems, we ran into 130 systems in 87 homes. Most homes, the vast majority of homes, have either a gas or a propane furnace. Not all do, but among the many furnaces that we ran into, we didn't find a single one that was below 92% efficient. They went all the way up to 98% efficient. And then up in the northern part of the state, where you have a lot of homes that don't have natural gas service, you just run into a much more complex mix of heating strategies, ducted and ductless heat pumps, even electric boilers. And the average home, for homes that don't have natural gas service, the average home has 2 different heating systems, and some had 3 or 4. For cooling systems, just about everybody had some form of cooling. The large majority have central AC systems. We did run into some ducted heat pumps, and you can see we had a small percentage of homes that have a ductless heat pump in it. Among the stuff that has a seasonal energy efficiency rating, or SEER, about half of the homes are down at the federal minimum of SEER 13. We did have systems that went all the way up to SEER 21. All the really high SEER stuff is either centrally ducted or ductless heat pumps that involve variable speed compressors, you know, kind of high-end equipment. For water heaters, about half of homes statewide have just your kind of your basic tank type natural gas or propane water heater. They're all power vented. We didn't find a single atmospherically vented water heater in the study. About 1 in 3 homes has your basic tank type electric water heater. But we did find about 1 in 10 homes that had a tankless water heater, fuel fired gas or propane. All of those were high efficiency condensing units that, you know, have a uniform energy factor of 0.9 or higher. And a fair number of those were combination systems that were being used both to provide space heating and domestic hot water. And then we did find a few indirect fired systems. That's where you have a space heating boiler that also can send heat to a separate storage tank that is used for domestic hot water. Not a whole lot of those. For lighting, we averaged about 100 sockets per home, 93% of which are in hardwired fixtures. So there's not a whole lot of plug-in lighting out there that we ran into. Among the hardwired stuff that's subject to code, we found, if you count up all the light bulbs in all the home, it's about 75% LED, 8% compact or linear fluorescent. But we do have about 17% out there in the hardwired category that were incandescent or halogen. And if you look at it on a per home basis, we had everything from 100% incandescent to 100% LED and just about everything in between. Okay, so let's spend a couple minutes talking about that beyond code potential, that 25% beyond code potential that I mentioned earlier. So we break this out into measures here. We actually looked at like 20 potential measures for going beyond code. Some of those are mutually exclusive. A couple of them didn't really end up showing much of anything, so we dropped them. But we got 15 measures here that we show on this graph that's sorted with the ones on the top having the highest average potential impact on energy costs, and the one on the bottom having the lowest potential impact, and also showing our margin of sampling error. So you can see how uncertain those are just from a sampling perspective, nothing to do with the modeling there. And what you can see is that on the top, there's like 4 measures that sort of separate themselves out as being a little bit head and shoulders above the other measures that we looked at. So I'll talk about those in a little more detail. The top one is R30 above grade walls. So code requires R20 or R21 wall insulation, which the vast majority of builders meet by putting up 2x6 stick framing and putting R20, R21 cavity insulation in place. But we did encounter some home that had either structural insulated panels or insulated concrete forms instead of stick frame construction. And with that approach, you can easily get to R30 or higher for above grade walls. I think we had 4 SIP homes and 1 ICF home in the study. So we know there's already a few homes that are being put up with that approach. And our analysis suggested if you could magically push every home up to that R30 level, on average, you'd get about 4% reduction in annual energy costs, all in energy costs. Then the next one is air leakage. So even though we found that most homes are already above code in terms of air leakage, we also know that with passive house type techniques, you can drive air leakage way down to like 0.5 air changes per hour. So when we simulate all homes in the sample being at 0.5 ACH 50, that's worth maybe 3.75% energy cost savings statewide if you got all homes to that level. And then I had mentioned a few homes we had that had triple pane windows. So triple pane high performance windows in every home get you a little less than 3.5% savings. And then last but not least, albeit with a fair amount of uncertainty on it, is heat pump water heaters, which are noteworthy in a couple of ways. One, this is one place where we kind of relaxed our rule that the beyond code measure that we set it at whatever the most efficient home in the study was. We kind of set that rule aside there because we didn't actually encounter any heat pump electric water heater in our sample, but we know they can be done. So we modeled that as our high performance water heating, one of our high performance water heating measures. And you can see that on average statewide, that gives you a little more than 3% energy cost reduction, but that's a blend. We did not model any kind of fuel switching here. So we can only take the electric water heaters that were in our sample and modeled them with heat pump water heaters. So this 3-something% is a mix of, you know, like 11 or 12% savings for the homes that have electric water heaters, but only accounted for the 30% of homes that have that water heating fuel. Oops. Whoa, I just like skipped way ahead here. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm just gonna wrap it up here quickly with recommendations. So first of all, you know, our top recommendation is that utility programs should structure their programs to incentivize going beyond current practice, given that finding a no difference. We think there's room to push the envelope. The beyond code savings potential we found suggests that there's plenty of technical potential to do so. We also recommend, you know, looking at the logic model for new construction programs and trying to, you know, come to a common understanding of the role of these programs in moving the market forward. I already talked about the 3 different, you know, the fact that we found pretty widespread issues with mechanical ventilation in new homes and the 3 different things that could be done there. And then the last one that I haven't really said much except in the very beginning is that circling back to that 20% of the market that is in rural areas that are generally not subject to code enforcement, that has a more, it doesn't have gas service, so has a, it's just like a different critter in terms of like what the homes look like and in terms of like the mix of heating and cooling strategies that are going into those. They're by and large served by smaller rural cooperatives. So our recommendation would be to look into maybe a way that for those cooperatives to kind of pool together resources and create a joint program to kind of address the unique needs of that market, because individually those cooperatives just don't have the resources to, you know, run a new construction program. Okay, so that's my dog and pony. Ready to turn it over back to Mary Sue.
Great. Thanks, Scott, for that great presentation. We've gone a little bit over our time. We're almost at noon right now. And I'd like to go a little over so we can get at least some questions in and do a quick wrap up. So I'm hoping that people can stick with us for at least 5 minutes of questions here. If you have not already done so, please type your questions into the Q&A box and send them to us now. And again, if we don't get to all the questions, we'll answer them all and send out the results to everyone who participated in the webinar. So, Lindsay, do you have any questions for Scott at this point?
Yeah, we have a bunch of good questions coming in, and Mary Sue, if you can just cut me off when you need to transition to the final slides. So Scott, what version of the IECC does Minnesota currently use?
I like an easy one to start off with. Minnesota is currently IECC 2012 with amendments, especially the mechanical ventilation is an important one.
Excellent. Will you, or in the final report, or within the scope of this project, will you be discussing any incremental builder costs for any of the 4 areas related to energy costs?
Yeah, great question. Something I was supposed to have said earlier. Yeah, one of the limitations of this study is, you know, we got as far as looking at technical potential for some of the beyond code measures. We did not look at all at like how much it would cost to do those measures, or look at like how willing builders might be to entertain some of them. So there's, you know, that's part of what makes that 25% pretty pie in the sky, and that reality would, you know, from incremental cost perspective and builder willingness to go forward with some of these things would certainly roll that potential back to what's realistic. But no, there's nothing in the report at all about incremental cost.
Great. What was the representation of mini splits, and were there any in the cold climate systems?
What
Or
representation?
sorry,
of
let
mini-
me
Oh,
let me
go ahead.
clarify. What was the representation of mini splits, and were any cold climate systems?
I see. I can't speak off the top of my head about how many were cold climate in the sense of showing, good performance down to low temperatures. We did have about, I think, 3% statewide of mini splits. I know that most of those were in the north. And so I think what's going on is, once you don't have natural gas service, you're more inclined to, maybe put in an electric boiler and use a mini split to get your cooling or something. So I want to say that many of them had you would call cold climate mini split, but I'm pretty sure that not all of them were. But that's about as precise as I can be off the top of my head.
When will the final report be available for folks?
Oh, that might be a question for Lindsay and Mary Sue. When is that thing getting posted?
It'll probably be,
soon.
yeah, it'll probably be available in like a month or so. I'm hoping a month and a half, something like that.
Okay.
We're kind of.
All right. For those homes heated with electricity, how many have natural gas or propane backup heating?
Could you repeat that again? I missed the first part of it.
Yep. For those homes heated with electricity, how many have natural gas or propane backup heating?
I believe we only had one home that was fully all electric in terms of heat. We had quite a few dual fuel. Well, I don't want to say quite a few, but we had a decent sample of dual fuel heat pumps where somebody had a propane furnace and had, backed up or paired with a ducted air source heat pump. And then we had a few electric boilers, but I think those mostly had another propane system involved. I hope that got the gist of the question.
All right, there are a couple other questions, though how they're phrased, they're not like full sentences. So I would recommend for the remaining questions that we take a look at those and then respond.
Yeah, and anything that we didn't answer live now, I will respond individually to folks who posed questions that we didn't get to.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And we'll also send them out to people generally so they can see the full questions and the answers.
Oh, okay, good.
Yep. So thanks for that that session on the presentation and also for the Q&A. I'm just going to show this slide. When the final report and webinar recordings are available, you can link to them from our Applied Research and Development webpage, which is indicated on this slide. There's other resources there, and there is the webinar address is the web address is at the bottom of this slide. Then I also just, again, want to thank you for participating and point out that there's 3 upcoming webinars that are coming up that are card results will be presented. One is on September 22nd with Slipstream, again, capturing energy savings in new commercial construction, the webinar that Scott referred to at the beginning of the presentation. Then on the 29th, Slipstream will be back again to talk about commercial light levels and saving costs on reducing light levels to the required amount. And then October 20th, there'll be a presentation by Center for Energy and Environment on looking at dehumidification in Minnesota family homes. If you have further questions about the webinars, please contact me. If you have questions about this specific webinar, please feel free to contact any of us. And you can also keep abreast of upcoming webinars and other news related to CIP by signing up for SIP updates on our mailing list, and that address is linked on here. And then finally, just a word, there is a survey that will pop up after you leave the webinar. So please take a minute to answer that, those questions, so that we can improve our webinars. Thank you. And again, thanks again for your participation today, and have a good rest of your day. And yeah, thank you. And with that, we'll sign off.